Hey everybody, you're listening to Cantus Firmus at the Movies. This is something new I'm trying where we're doing a sort of theological and philosophical analysis of film, or films. I got here for our first episode, Nick. Now, I've always said Quint, is that correct?
That actually is. You're one of the few people that actually gets it right on the first try.
Got this, yeah, spelled Q-U-I-E-N-T, so I can see that, yeah. So we've sort of been in contact some through Facebook. Was familiar with you because of your work in Rethinking Hell and some excellent stuff there. So it might be cool to kind of introduce yourself a little bit, interested in kind of what you're working on, your educational background. I think I understand you have educational background in film as well as theology.
Yeah, that's right. Well, one, thank you just for having me on. It's a great idea and it's a great film. So yeah, my background centers on I did a associate's and a bachelor's in screenwriting and also in film production. So that's kind of my undergrad background. But at Biola, you're kind of required to take a what's the term? It's not, it doesn't show up on your transcripts, but it's kind of it's basically you have to do 30 units of Bible. So essentially it's a minor in Bible. But it's not on your transcript or on your diploma. So I have a minor in Bible from Biola, the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, as they say. And once I graduated, about 2 or 3 years later, I went to Fuller Theological Seminary, and I'm doing a master's in, basically it's New Testament. They've revamped their program. Essentially, it's a master's in New Testament now. And it's kind of a weird shift. I decided I didn't want to make any money that I wasn't making in the film industry and decided I wanted to make less money in ministry somehow. And yeah, so that's kind of my background or educational background. The reason I opted or suggested this film was one, it was the first film or the trailer when I worked in a movie theater for about 3 years while I was after high school. And when I saw this trailer, I was doing a theater check, which, you walk down, you count heads, you make sure the exit door is taken care of, right, and stuff like that. And so I'm coming back up, this trailer comes on. And I'd never seen anything like that. And I was raised on films like Casablanca and like the old school noir, black and white films and stuff like that. And when I saw this trailer, I was spellbound. Like I'd never seen anything like this in a modern sense, right? And so that was the moment I wanted to see this sort of thing. And it gave me kind of an insight into the power of cinema when it breaks new ground or does something interesting. And I'd been a fan of Frank Miller for a while because my dad, gave me a bunch of Batman comics and stuff like that. So it was kind of it kind of coalesced into a really powerful experience of seeing that and then deciding I want to make movies. And now, of course, I don't really want to, per se. I mean, if someone threw a bunch of money at me, I totally would. But seeing that trailer was kind of, the trailer for Cynthia was kind of the impetus for me being like, I want to do stuff like that. And so, yeah, that's kind of, so this film has always had a special place in my heart, so to speak.
Well, and this was like a year before the 300, so this would have been probably like really the first film that really used that very comic bookish sort of aesthetic that I can think of.
Yep.
Yeah, there's another one that comes to mind that's slightly similar. Well, actually came out a couple years later. It's an Argentinian film called La Antena, but it has a little bit of bit of that style, but it's actually after this as well. So this kind of was unique for the time, as far as the look of it.
Yeah, it broke massive ground in terms of what you could do in terms of digitization and just the contrastation and stuff like that. And it was really the first time I think my generation had seen noir, but done so in a way that it was so, abstract and postmodern and so cartoony-ish that it was a completely unique vision. And of course, you couple with Frank Miller's just trademark dialogue, you're just like, holy snickerdoodle, this is awesome. And so it basically took everything I was raised on, the black and white, Mickey, what's his name, Chandler and Spillane and Humphrey Bogart and all that kind of stuff, and just wove it all together. And it's like, oh, this is something we've had kind of in our childhood that's basically been pumped full of steroids and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, it broke massive ground, and it told a really interesting set of stories that had never quite been told in terms of characters and stuff like that. So yeah, I 100% agree with you. It really broke the ground.
Yeah, and I was going to say too, I definitely, I want to talk about the plot a little bit, but the style is kind of so interesting. When it first opens up, it almost feels like a perfume ad.
Yeah.
And then it kind of moves on from there, and you really see the noir feel. It reminded me in particular of a Bogart film called Dark Passage. Especially because there's the character who's got the new face and the plastic surgery. He's sort of out of prison and he's trying to hide. And so that was one that came to mind. We'll talk about it later, but I also thought that the priest Rourke, his scene is very Apocalypse Now. It kind of has a feel to me. It's very much like Kurtz, or Brando in Apocalypse Now. So maybe it would be good to start with just kind of going over the plot a little bit, and maybe I'll just start by saying that it at first it felt like a series of vignettes, but they are connected.
Yeah.
So it's reminding me a little bit of Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia, but maybe not quite so. What's the word I'm looking for? Maybe I think Magnolia is trying to be something very, very, very high-minded, whereas this is high concept, but not quite as pretentious. Maybe is the word I'm looking for. I like Magnolia, but I would say that this film comes up as less pretentious for sure.
No, absolutely. I remember in film school, Magnolia was kind of the pinnacle of what you could do vignette and intersectionality style, like how plots would intersect and characters would intersect. And then I watched Sin City. I'm like, no, I think this is the kind of film that does it at a bare bones level, even in a much more interesting and I think fun way than Magnolia. Magnolia, of course, isn't fun to watch in terms of fun being the operative word. But it does. Magnolia is, I think, too highbrow for it to work as a concept. There's too many characters, too much stuff going on. And I think that's part of the thing P.T. Anderson wanted was that kind of discordant feeling, whereas Sin City, it's more of an operatic kind of feel. And so it works really well. But so I agree with you on that.
Sure. Yeah. And just clarify, actually, I love Magnolia. And I would say that it's not necessarily fun, except for Tom Cruise, who's brilliant in it.
That scene where he's being interviewed is one of the best scenes of the movie, personally.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Well, I don't want to go too much into Anderson, but yes, I was going to say too. I love how he takes actors that you sort of tend to not take seriously and puts them in a role that suddenly you're like, oh my gosh, this. I couldn't imagine this is perfect for this actor, first of all, but I never imagined him in a role where I really thought he was brilliant. You know what I mean? And I think he did that with Adam Sandler. But in the case of Sin City, it's this, kind of fictional city that, it's very kind of dingy, very dirty. There's a lot of violence, a lot of crime, a lot of corruption. And so there's these kind of, these characters sort of connect in some way or another, but there's these kind of free agent prostitutes who are one part of town, and they're big and connected to the story. And there's a cop who played by Bruce Willis who tries to save a little girl from a pedophile and child murderer who happens to be the son of a senator, I believe, a powerful senator. Yeah. Also named Rourke, who I think is he the brother of the priest?
Yep, he's the brother of the Cardinal Rourke.
Cardinal. Yeah, and so I mean I can't imagine that they're being named Rourke is not a reference to Atlas Shrugged.
Yeah.
Or not Atlas Shrugged, but Rourke is not Atlas Shrugged, is it?
Is that Fountainhead?
Fountainhead. Rourke is Fountainhead.
Yeah. Yep. I'm ashamed that I know that. I went through my Ayn Rand phase in so I'm ashamed that I know.
I never quite went through an Ayn Rand phase. I tried Atlas Shrugged when I was 12 or 13. I got about 100 pages through it, and I was like, I can't do this. But
well, you made it longer than I did. I got like 50 pages and just shut it and said, yeah, I can't do this.
Yeah. But so at any case, all these sort of plot points. I mean, it'd be hard. I don't. Like, can you think of a better way to sum it up than I? I mean, it's tough to summarize exactly the plot.
Yeah. It's at a base level. What it is, I think, is you have characters who were at one point probably honorable people, good people, and the basic plot line is how corruption and sin essentially eats away at any sort of decency or integrity that you have. And so it's essentially what Miller, I think, does with all 7 Sin City novels is he basically takes these heroic characters, like, for example, Marv, Dwight, and Hartigan for the purpose of our film. Marv is kind of Conan in a trench coat. I think that's how he described him. He's just a big burly man who has, kind of an old school medieval style of honor, right? And Dwight is kind of, the Lancelot, and Hartigan is, well, I mean, he's the Dirty Harry kind of guy. And so all 3 characters, what Miller does essentially is take these 3 characters and throws battery acid at them over and over for the course of 200 to 300 pages of plot, and to see how they react to the sin in the world, essentially, the sin of Sin City. So Marv is, trying to avenge the death of the one woman or prostitute, whoever was kind to him, i.e. had sex with him, but still in that kind of world, that's how he interprets it. And Dwight essentially is trying to protect William from a corrupt cop, and that, of course, spirals out of control. And Hardigan, as you said, is kind of the one guy, the one shining example on the police force who is willing to go the extra mile to protect the innocent. And so essentially that's kind of the broad scope of these three characters, is how they interact, how they overlap with one another, and how they interact in a world that is consumed by sin. So I think that's kind of the basic plot line. I mean, we could go into detail, but I mean, part of the fun of this film, obviously not for children. I want to say that right up front. Do not watch this with your kids. But I think that's kind of the base level of how these three characters and the entire character of the people of Sin City interact with a world of crime and sin and perversion and death.
Sure. Well, and I'll sort of add a note. I mean, this is an interesting film to start with for sort of a theological analysis of movies, because it
it's true.
Yeah, I mean, so to begin with, if there's there's language, there's violence, there's decent amount of nudity and some sexual content. So just to be aware, because I don't want anybody who's listening to this who would feel uncomfortable watching a movie like that to sort of go, oh, I should watch this without hearing this warning.
No, I never endorse a film for people that I know would maybe stumble somebody or make it a problem. It's like, I like this film, I can handle it. You might not be able to. Don't watch it if you can't handle it. There's no shame in
Sure.
that.
So, but it is an interesting film to start with because, on the surface, it would seem to be devoid of theological content. But I think that the more you look at it, there's a lot to really think about and discuss. And before we maybe go into that too much more, I will we talked about stylistically kind of some of the things that we noticed about it, and there were some places. And I think this might have been part of the appeal of it to some degree. The kind of ultra macho kind of dialogue in places where it almost like seemed like something that, like, when I was like 13, I would have thought like, oh, that's really cool, like that's really BA or whatever. Like the scene where I have trouble remembering character names sometimes, but the ugly dude talks about kind of how. Just kind of how hardcore he is, and he talks about she tried to analyze me once but got too scared, and I'm like, oh, that would have been something I would have put on my MySpace when I was 13 years old or something.
Yeah, it's like your top 8 right there.
Yeah. And something that I noticed, a line that shows up in sort of the first 2 vignettes is I think it's repeated almost word for word. No reason to play it quiet. And I thought that sort of is, if you were to summarize the style of the film in just a few words, I think that that catches it. No reason to play it quiet.
No, I think that's perfect. Yeah.
So it's definitely very comic bookish, very over the top in the dialogue and the look of it and the violence and the visual, which is not at all necessarily a bad thing. It's just it's not subtle for sure.
Yeah.
So I wanted to sort of maybe start by talking about a few themes that I noticed and sort of see where you go with it, and then maybe we'll just kind of see where things go from there.
Yeah, go for it, please.
Yeah. So there were the key thing that I was seeing was the portrayal of violence as redemptive. And there was the line, I'm killing my way to the truth, which I thought was also sort of one of those lines that was sort of a kind of a pivotal line that sort of summarized something about what was happening in the film. And violence is sort of treated as an act of love in a number of places. So, Bruce Willis's character, the policeman who kills the murder of the girl, or the attempted murder of the girl, and also emasculates the child rapist. There's also I need to write these character names down. So Bruce Willis, Bruce Willis is what's the cops? What's his name?
Yeah, that was Hardigan.
Hardigan, thank you. And the ugly dude who goes on after the killer.
Marv,
Marv. Okay, thank you. So okay, then there's also
and Dwight's the Lancelot dude with the long hair, who's kind of the suave Bond kind of guy.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. So Marv going after the killer of the prostitute.
Also, by the way, spoiler alert for anyone, if you plan on watching it, probably not the best time to listen to this podcast.
Oh,
but,
sorry, yeah.
10 years or 10 or 12 years later, it's your own fault.
Sure.
And by the way, Bruce Willis dies at the end of Sixth Sense, guys. Sorry, in case you didn't know that.
It almost doesn't make it in this one either, but there seems like a very strong sort of sense of eye for an eye, and the one exception to that is Bruce Willis's character at the end sort of turns the redemptive violence myth on its head by giving up his own life in a sense to save someone else. He doesn't, he sort of acknowledges that, there's only so far that you can go with violence to redeem a bad situation, or to act out in love towards someone else. It's very limited, and he sort of comes up against the limit of violence, of redemptive violence there, and realizes that he has to do something different. And so I wouldn't want to say too strongly that Bruce Willis's character Hartigan is a Christ figure, but there's certainly a moment where I see that. Well, do you want to go from there, and then I'll note the other thing that I was sort of pulling out of it, if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. I think I would actually probably go further than you.
Okay.
I think he actually, for a literary device, he is a Christ figure. I mean, that's that's something I think most people at least will be like, yeah. I mean, he's obviously not a 1-for-1. It's like Neo in the Matrix isn't a 1-for-1 correspondent. But I mean, most people who aren't Christian would look at Neo in the Matrix, for example, and be like, yeah, we kind of get what he represents. At least the typology of it. It's not like the Adam and Christ typology of like Romans or Corinthians, but we get a sense of the correspondence. So the idea being. I think, to build on what you said about the idea of the myth of redemptive violence, I think what Miller does with the Hartigan storyline that's really interesting is the violence in that is very much about Hartigan is really restrained with a lot of what he does. And if you look at the other vignettes, the violence, they're action sequences. You know what I mean? There's fight sequences on and on, Marv taking out 10 guys, with a hatchet, and stuff like that. So it's kind of amped up. With the Hartigan storyline, it's much more about how the spiral of violence kind of keeps going teleologically until it reaches a focal point, and it's actually very anticlimactic, which is what I think Miller wanted. You know what I mean? And so it kind of keeps going and going until at the end, the violence actually feels real because it's being inflicted on an innocent. Right. By the end, the serial killer has the girl who's run up and he's preparing to do all these horrible things to her. And at that point, the violence in the film has been really kind of cool. Like, oh, guy gets his hand cut off and there's white blood everywhere. And it's really just kind of cool. It's kind of cool. But the weight of the violence in the Hartigan storyline keeps amping up. So it actually becomes far more emotionally intense. And so I think what Miller does is essentially actually is saying at this point, and that there is a blowback to violence. You know what I mean? There's a sense in which the repercussions of these sorts of things have a teleological effect until they can only keep going until there is that final moment of when does this stop? And I think you kind of get a bit of that with Marv's storyline. But in the Hartigan storyline, that's how it ends. It's the deconstruction of violence to the point where the only way to end this is to commit the ultimate act of violence. And that is to essentially do what Christ did, to bring that back around, is to sacrifice yourself for the good of an innocent. And I think that ultimately is kind of Miller's commentary on violence, is that the only way to be nonviolent is to basically remove yourself from the equation so that another person may live and continue on, so to speak.
No, that's a very interesting take on it, because I'm
not saying I'm right, by the way. I'm just saying that's what I took out of it.
That's interesting. Okay, so I'll point out that where I sort of saw something very different. To begin with, there was a line I think Marv says, "Hell is waking up every day and not knowing why you're here," and so that Sin City is, the people in Sin City are people who don't have a sense really of purpose, apart from, there's a sort of sense of, getting a little bit of love where you can, while you can.
Hmm.
There's also, the only other people who I sort of felt like seem like they have a sense of purpose are the people who are the villains. And so,
Hmm.
where I sort of watched the film, it sort of felt like, if Michel Foucault made a film with Sam Peckinpah. So it's like there's this kind of very, so one example is that religion seems to be painted, pretty much without exception, as a source of cruelty.
Yeah.
And religious figures view themselves as doing the work of God through cruelty.
Yeah.
The same seems, the cruelty is also sort of this, common theme for, politicians, anybody in power,
Yeah.
sometimes just men in general. There's sort of a sense that evil is patriarchal. There's two different times where I think Bruce Willis refers to a penis as a weapon.
Yeah.
So there's a sort of idea that what's really evil are these traditional power structures. And so the heroes, who are kind of anti-heroes, they're using the exact same tools of violence, but they're the heroes because they're transgressing the establishment rules, for one, but also because there's also a sense of relationality, that exists with them that you don't see as much in the power, sort of in the characters that, well, I guess there is a little bit. I mean, you have the love of the senator for his son, who's a sort of a twisted freak and that kind of thing. But, but it's interesting to me to sort of see how the same, kind of uber violence seems to be justified when it's being done by somebody who is, kind of the dregs of society or doesn't really have power in a traditional sense. But when it's, being inflicted by somebody who's has power of some kind, that's how you know that they're the bad guys. The way you tell apart the good violence from the bad violence is who's doing it.
Yeah.
And one thing that was kind of interesting watching it, and it seemed like there was sometimes a juxtaposition of ideas that seemed to almost be contradictory. So as I watched it, I felt that, like, male sexuality, for example, was simultaneously viewed as hostile, but also was pandered to, in a sense. There's a very strong sense of the male gaze throughout the film. Male sexuality is sometimes portrayed as good, but usually only when it's receptive, not when it's, initiating. It's, I think there's, a very strong sense of, sexuality when it's coming from a female character, is viewed as, more positive. When it's coming from a male character, it's a lot less likely to be a positive thing.
Yeah.
So, as I kind of watched that, I sort of saw, kind of these sort of postmodern ideas. I guess what I would say, and what I sort of see in, the kind of left-wing, dichotomy of, oppressor and oppressed, and that was sort of the framework that reality was viewed through. And so it didn't necessarily matter if the oppressor and the oppressed used the same tools, killed the same amount of people. What made the oppressor bad was that he was the oppressor. He had power. And what made the oppressed good was that he lacked it, or she lacked it. So as I watched it, I sort of got this more, postmodern feel, and it felt more like Bruce Willis's character, the policeman, Hartigan. It's sometimes tough to get a sense of, what exactly the, well, I haven't read the books either. So, what Frank Miller is getting at in the comics, and, what Rodriguez is getting at, and Miller as well in the film. So it almost felt like Bruce Willis's, sort of sacrificial act felt a little bit out of place with where the movie was going. But your interpretation that, it was, that violence was sort of, being deconstructed in that, conclusion, with Bruce Willis's character Hartigan, is an interesting one. But it just, but for me, it almost felt like I was watching two different movies at that point.
Well, I suspect that's kind of what, at least in that storyline, that's what Miller and Rodriguez wanted, or at least that's how I interpret it.
Mm-hmm.
Because what, let's say, Hartigan is willing to endure is some of the most intense violence of the film, being beaten, being locked away in a cage, and being humiliated, and all these sorts of things. He's willing to endure essentially the worst of Sin City in order to protect someone. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think what Miller and Rodriguez are kind of getting at with this is, we see, to bring in what you said, which a lot of which I agree with, is the idea of the power structure of, let's say religion and politics. The power structure of religion and politics, and at least we should say in an enlightenment sense, the suspicion of these things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the issue then becomes, how does a good man, in the case of Hartigan, navigate this terrain? Does he, and basically what he does is essentially lets it brutalize him until the point where he's not really human anymore. And so we see the effect on that. But I think and this is something Miller, I think, said at some point, is if you want to see how virtuous a character is, throw them in sin and see what they do.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so how I interpreted his storyline, and it doesn't apply, I don't think, to Dwight's storyline per se, nor to Dwight's, but so we'll focus on Hartigan's storyline just to make that distinction. What he does, what Miller, I think, is doing, is basically saying there's a character that embodies what we would say is basic decency, right? Something in the real world is something that we accept as something that is just good and holy and just. And Miller, by making him an old man it's no mistake that he has a heart problem, kind of the running joke.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that he's an old man, that he's about to retire, and this is his one last good deed in an exemplary career where he never compromised, never was corrupted, and is basically keeps going with the right thing, is meant to be out of place, because the city itself destroys men like this, but it hasn't destroyed him. And so in some sense, the idea of, the Lancelot, the one hero, so to speak, we see it embodied in him. And so that's why I think it feels out of place, but I think it's meant to. Whereas with Marv's story, if we bring back in the Enlightenment idea of politics and religion, Marv has a small cross on, which I found interesting. It's not garish, it's not cool, it's just kind of a little thing that hangs around his chest, and he kind of just keeps going on with his day.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you look at the religious power structures, it's very garish, or garage, however you say that word. It's very, showy, it's everything, there's huge crosses everywhere. The priests are all gross and detestable, but Marv, it's weird that Marv would have a small, tiny, barely noticeable cross on his chest the entire movie.
Mm-hmm.
I never understood why that is, per se, but it strikes me as something as kind of maybe what Miller is getting at. And I don't know if he's religious. I think he's kind of a deist in some sense, but he's very much, at least politically now, he's become far more libertarian and has kind of a respect, I think, for history, as we would say. The idea of that little cross, or that Hartigan, or even the heroism that Marv does, or Dwight does, is a symbol of something that is of a bygone era. You know what I mean? If we look at modern politics, you and I both are fairly close politically, I think. The idea of we're in an environment of post-truth. You know what I mean? We live in an era where you can literally say something on national TV and people either accept it as, a certain part of the population will accept it as gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think Miller is doing with the Hartigan character, and to some extent with the Dwight and Marv character, is essentially saying truth still has something, even if it's old and dated and broken.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's kind of what he's trying to get at. And he uses the Roman Catholic Church and politics as a way of expressing kind of the base norm that we all accept. Big organization, corruption, corporatism, and stuff like this, it's a given. But what happens to the person who resists, so to speak, and not that stupid kind of, political ease you find on Twitter, resist the powers or whatever, anything like that. But you really see where I'm coming from? Like, I think, am I making some sort of sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I follow what you're saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's what I think they're trying to get at. It's a bit clumsier, I think, in Marv and Dwight's story, but in Hartigan's story, for me, it's quite clear.
Well, I would say, Hartigan seems like he's doing something similar to what Marv is doing, but it's a little bit less sullied, I guess. Hartigan is still actively violent.
Yeah.
In a lot of cases, but there's also a willingness to put down the tools of violence when he feels that they're not going to get the job done. I guess Marv doesn't necessarily have that approach. He's he sort of leads with violence.
Well, that's interesting too. Just to really jump in, what Hartigan does throughout I think it's the prologue, because they switch time and stuff like that. What he does at the beginning is he keeps telling the character, it comes out a little more clear in the graphic novel, is let her go.
Mm-hmm.
He's bleeding, he's got the gun, he's willing to kill him, but he keeps telling him, let her go.
Mm-hmm.
All these sorts of things. And there is kind of, I think, a resistance to actually using that cannon that he has. And, this sort of idea of this is going to be really bad if you don't put the gun down, sort of thing. Whereas with Marv, it's like, sweet, give me the hatchet, let's go, baby, And so there's an interesting, I think, the character dynamic or contrast between the two, I think, is really interesting. I just wanted to throw that in there. I thought that was really interesting.
Oh yeah. Well, and I remember there's I think a bit where Marv talks about interrogating a character, and and he says he gets all this. He claims to get this information out of him, but as you're watching the scene, he's driving through apparently a busy city street, and dragging the guy's face through the asphalt, and you're thinking, well, what possibly could you get out of this guy now? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But yeah, there's certainly this idea we're going to lead with that.
It's kind of the whole idea of, it's the glorification, I think, of violence. And so I think that's why the two are, they're tonally very jarring, I think would be a good word, right? I think you mentioned how Hartigan feels almost out of place,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what Miller wants, because Marv is kind of, he is a barbarian in a trench coat. Miller flat out says, I think even the character Dwight says he'd be at home on some ancient battlefield swinging an axe into somebody's face. And so it's the idea that violence for him is it's the air you breathe. Whereas with Hartigan, violence is not foreign, but it's not something he breathes.
Mm-hmm. It's a tool that's appropriate when it's useful. Or when
he's a just war kind of guy. He's not a instant interventionist, as we could say.
Sure.
Or the good style of Jeff. There we go. Yeah, he's not about dropping bombs on their moms yet.
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier, and I thought this was kind of interesting. If Cardinal Rourke is really trying to kind of throw back to the character of Kurtz in Apocalypse Now, because it seems that way. I mean, aesthetically and thematically, he's a character who is sort of playing God, as Kurtz did, and sort of determining what sins are worthy of punishment and which sins are not, and there's also I kind of discussed this in a recent podcast, but the idea, and I kind of mentioned it earlier too, the idea that the left tends to look at things in terms of oppressor and oppressed, and the right tends to look at things in terms of order and chaos. And so, when you look at any, you name any political issue really, but I mean, one that comes to mind would be the idea of like police brutality. A leftist will always see that in terms of there's the militant wing of the corrupt government are the police, and then the oppressed are the people being on the other side of the violence. Whereas the conservative will say, well, no, the police represent order, and the people who they're beating down represent chaos. So this is necessary to save the future of, So, and I see that sort of in Kurtz a little bit, that he justifies, all these sort of terrible acts of violence that are being perpetrated on these prostitutes, because they are they're sort of representing this force that he views as sort of chaotic, of outside of the way society is supposed to function. And as a result, somebody who has power, who's on that, that side of the equation, it's perfectly acceptable for them to, use violence against them, to punish them, to remove them from society, and essentially to be God, to judge what's appropriate and what's not. And I don't know. I wondered if you had felt that there was sort of something going on there that was, sort of hearkening back a little bit to Apocalypse Now, or the the original source material underlying it.
I'm not sure. The idea of power is obviously a very prominent theme in here, especially if you cast it in light of the dichotomy between oppressed and oppressor, so to speak, which I think is a very easy way to categorize. I don't like it, but it's an easy way just to kind of categorize it. And so I think the issue with Sin City um, is something I think Mayor Rourke or Senator Rourke, I forget his exact title,
I
with
think he
Powers
was,
Booth, who's
yeah, I thought he was senator, but
okay, that makes sense. Got his he got his brother made governor, and so he's probably senator. He's up there. We'll say that. We'll
mhm.
call him President Rourke. That'll make it easier. So President
Uh-huh.
Rourke tells Hartigan, who is powerless in a situation, and he's got a gun on him. You know, he could kill him right there. And says power doesn't come from a gun. Power is lying, getting everyone else to repeat and believe the lie. And in
Mhm.
this current political climate, that's chilling. That
Mhm.
is, I mean, I don't think Miller would appreciate this, but that's prophetic almost. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? So the sense in which you can say things that are just blatantly untrue, and people will believe them and act upon them, reveals, I think, something that has been going on in our modern political world is the idea of the strong man. You know, the Woodrow Wilson kind of not Ted Kennedy, not Ted Kennedy, Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt.
Mhm.
The idea that the president or the person in power needs to be the strong person, the person with absolute power, you know, so to speak.
Mhm.
And in this story, we get kind of the conflation of the two, religion and politics, but we also get, I think, the idea of how is power to be wielded, so to speak. And
Mhm.
so if you break down, you know, you excuse the religion and the political aspect, how does the relationship between Marv's vengeance and Hartigan and Dwight, how do they act in relation to other people, so to speak, outside of the power structure? And there is kind of I think Miller plays it up. Obviously, you know, women in the film are super curvy and stuff like that, and the men are brutes and vicious and all this sort of thing. You know, he plays on the stereotype of the comic book world. Open up any modern comic, and the women are like triple F, and the dudes are like so heavy they'll top over. But what he does with it, I think, um, in terms of sexuality and that type of power, is there's a sense in which the man has power, but he uses it, you know, for in the instance of Marv, he's a huge beast, and his goal, and the goal he finds out, was the woman went to him for protection, you know, because he's a huge beast, and so he could protect her. And similarly with Dwight, and more so with Hartigan, is the idea being of there's a power in certain elements of how this is being conveyed. But
Mhm.
what is interesting with it is how the human dynamics work. Is there's kind of a one-to-one correspondence, which means that power is kind of deflated a bit, and that's what makes it so shocking when Goldie dies, right? Where,
Mhm.
you know, and all these sorts of ideas. And so when you have the relationship between the we'll say the structure and the individual, Miller seems to really want that to be broken and the individual to overcome and stuff like that. Whereas in the human to human, or the transitive element, you have the people are very much almost out of one-to-one correspondence in terms of how they relate to one another, which I thought was really interesting.
Mhm.
And, you know, for example, Marv talks about how he treats women. I don't hurt girls. I mean, you know, that's something we see. Oh, that's basic decency. But in that world, that's supremely chivalrous. You know what Hartigan does, supremely chivalrous. You know, kind of a 1930s morality almost, in some sort of sense. Kind of, oh yeah, you give her a kiss and you send her on her way back home. You know, sort of thing. And I think that's not Miller's like, oh yeah, let's go back to the 1950s. But he is commenting, I think, on the idea of power back then was you used what you had for the good of the other, and you didn't lord it over the other.
Mhm.
And what he's critiquing now is the modern world has become not about that. And so when you talk about, you know, people abusing their power and free speech and censorship and, you know, banning people, you know, all these sorts of things that we're kind of steamrolling into, I think this becomes far more prophetic in a scary way.
Mhm. I you talked about the idea of chivalry, and one thing that and so to be clear, you'd suggested this movie, and I had a copy of it, but I hadn't had a chance to watch it yet. So I watched it for the first time pretty recently. And so you know, maybe on repeat viewings, I'll note other things, or reach different conclusions. But talking about chivalry, one thing I had kind of taken down as a note was that uh, trying to get a sense of how women are viewed or portrayed in the film. And, you know, in one sense, obviously, they are portrayed as, you know, sex objects visually.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I'm kind of I sort of noticed this dichotomy that women are simultaneously victims of male violence, but on the other hand, they are, you know, they can be sort of viewed as strong enough to take care of themselves.
Yeah.
You know, so you know, the character of Dwight attempts to help these women who are prostitutes, who sort of run their own show, but you know, the organized crime is sort of trying to come in and you know, bring them under patriarchal male control. And so he attempts to help, but you know, it's questionable how much you know, he ends up helping somewhat significantly, but you know, on the other hand, you could have imagined the scenario working out without him being involved.
Yeah, exactly.
So it was kind of, it was unclear a little bit to me how Miller or Rodriguez or both were trying to get me as the viewer to feel about women. And I don't know if it was because you know, Miller was of two minds, that on one hand, you know, women are just as good as men, and they're often put in a, you know, a terrible situation by patriarchal society. But on the other hand, I really like their breasts. You know what I mean? Like it's like, you know, I don't know exactly if I didn't know if you had a sense of a coherent viewpoint about how men and women were relating in this world, and presumably in ours, based on Miller's interpretation anyway.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that could be said. I think first off, I think Miller, I don't want to attribute to him coherence of mind in this sort of thing, but in my interpretation of what he said or how he wrote the story and all that sort of thing, I think he's been in the comic book world a long time. And let's face it, boobs sell. Half-naked women sell. You open up any comic book, even if it's for 12-year-olds, it's going to have the women are barely clothed and disproportionate, and the dudes are disproportionate. It's a fantasy. It's meant to kind of, everything's on steroids and on implants. And so what I think Miller does is he basically recognizes it and excurses this. Have you seen The Spirits, the film he directed? Did you
No, I haven't, but I've been interested in
watching.
Okay,
yeah, watch that when you get a second, and if you watch it as satire, it's genius. It's one of the best movies. Everyone hates the movie. I love it. But what Miller does in that, just to give some clarity, is he knows that this world is silly. He knows that this world is built on the idea of the women are, quote, helpless and yet, quote, strong. And basically he has to play up the sexualized aspect of it. And that's just, because that's the world of the comic. You have to, in some sense, imbibe at the well, so to speak, in terms of that in order to subvert it. And I think, I don't want to say he's intentional. Like, yes, I'm subverting, you know, patriarchal substructures and stuff like that. But I think how the women are portrayed, at least in The Spirit, and to some extent Sin City, is that he is basically, he's playing by the rules, but it's only because he's got another rule in mind. And so, for example, I mean, in Hardigan's story, at least the world of Sin City, as I understand it, is a world driven by, we would say, the male weapon, as Hardigan says. You know, he takes his weapon away, both of them, you know, so to speak. And what he does, I think, is Miller recognizes that the modern world, is built upon sex. It is based upon the premise that men are, we'll just use the word patriarchy. There's a patriarchal bent. We see it in pornography. We see it in marketing. We see this all sort of thing that appeals to the male ego and the male, quote, weapon. And so I think Miller recognizes that. And so he has to play the world. And he portrays the world, I think, in an honest way. Women, in order to survive in certain parts of the world, have to act this way. Or they're expected to act this way. So they are, either by choice or by not. And I think that's what he's kind of getting at when he portrays women like this, because, I mean, let's face it, there's a victimization element there that I think he tries to deconstruct, especially in Hardigan's story. And it's the idea of women being at the pleasure of the power structures. I mean, we also have, you know, women servicing clergy. That's a throwaway line, you know. It reveals that, I mean, the sin of sex or of patriarchy and sex goes so deep that it infects something that we all consider, in some sense, good. You know, remember, we were all shocked at the child abuse scandal in the Catholic Church a while back, right? We're all shocked because that's something that should not be. You know, that's black and white. That's so utterly contrary to the meaning of the Catholic Church or scripture or what have you. You know what I mean? So I think that's kind of what Miller's trying to get at. And I don't think he works it out, because on some sense he does imbibe at the river of sensuality and lust. And on the other hand, I think certain characters, how they speak about women, kind of begin to break that mold. But it's the world of vice, and to have any bit of virtue is to subvert the vice. The only problem is, what do you see in the vice that keeps you from seeing the virtue?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, and kind of a couple of things that sort of came to mind hearing you talk about kind of the situation that women were in, and in the film, and sort of how that sort of mirrors in some way the role that they play in society. And you know, one thing that sort of came to mind is how sort of like the 50s and 60s films of James Mansfield, where she is essentially a Marilyn Monroe, but she is also mocking Marilyn Monroe. So she's simultaneously the blonde bombshell who's, you know, bringing men into the theater because of her sexuality, while also sort of mocking the blonde bombshell idea. And so, you know, this idea of sort of using these tools to sort of subvert them is maybe a sort of an idea that comes to mind.
It's like, in order to make a really the quote bad movie, you know, you have to know how to make an actual bad movie. You know, you can't just say, I'm going to set out to make the worst B movie of all time, like The Room or the new King Kong or something like that. You have to know how to actually make what goes into making that kind of bad movie in order to actually make the movie. So you need to know the rules so you can break them. And I think Miller tries to do that. I don't know if he's successful.
Well, you know, I would say,
I think that's what he's trying to get at.
Yeah. Well, I would say one thing that, you know, seems like it may be something he's actually thought through a little bit is how women can often, with, you know, with great exactitude, use their power, the power and influence in the situation that they've been given. And, you know, I've heard some, you know, kind of feminist thinkers who are, you know, who've sort of maybe challenged the feminist orthodoxy a little bit. Christine Hoff Sommers, you know, comes to mind as an example of one of those, who sort of talked about the fact that feminism has, in some sense, undersold the power that women have had in previous generations when they didn't actually have power in a traditional structural kind of way. That you know, women used the influence, you know, you were in the situation they were in and used that power, used the power they had, you know, pretty cleverly. And you know, the I think it's My Big Fat Greek Wedding, where the husband talks about how, well, you know, the husband is the head of the woman or whatever, and she says yes, but the woman is the neck, and she turns the head any way she wants. And I think that's sort of one thing that you're sort of seeing in the film, that these women are living in this men's world, but they are not necessarily being subjugated by men. They are fully in control of their choices and their bodies, for the most part. There are examples where in the film where that's not the case. But certainly in the case of the you know, what do you call I was going to say a gaggle of prostitutes. I don't know what you refer to.
I have no idea. No idea.
But that's certainly the case with them.
And I think when we talk about modern, I hate the word feminism because it's such a hard thing to talk about now. I think we're in an era of post-feminism, so it's kind of like fourth or fifth wave. I don't even know where it's at. Like I don't even call myself one anymore. I'm just I think women are equal to men. I don't want to have to talk about intersectionality or how men are evil or women are evil. And so but I think what Miller kind of does, and building off what you said, because I think you're largely right, is the idea of I mean, we see this in scripture, how women have had to essentially make do with what little they've been given, and when they're given something, they just it's overabundance. So Ruth saves her entire people. You know, Deborah, you know, all these women in scripture kind of exceed the bounds, so to speak, of what they're traditionally been given. And the women in this, I think, kind of haven't been able to really break out of that, but how they cope in this sort of world is interesting, I think.
Well, another scriptural example that comes to mind is Abigail, whose husband Nabal, you know, she sort of works to stop him from destroying himself by being a lot more intelligent than he is. And so, you know, she, you know, recognizes where her limitations are in that society, but works very, I don't know, thriftily, I guess you might say, within those limitations to achieve the goals that she is looking to achieve.
Well, perhaps what Miller, maybe what Miller is trying to do, and this might be what I was trying to say, but stumbled a lot on, was that this is going to sound silly. Maybe what Miller's trying to do with these characters is say biology actually matters, right? So when he plays the men are brutish and this, it's not to say there's subordinates and overordinates or oppressors or sort of thing. It is to say that men and women are different. I mean, to say that in this modern political climate is, I mean, I'm probably going to lose Twitter followers if they ever listen to this podcast. But I think that's kind of what by blowing things out of proportion, right? He's showing that men and women are different. This is not to idealize the portrayal of women in Sin City. I don't want to say that, or the portrayal of men. But he is basically, by playing up this kind of thing, he is essentially saying, here's the differences in a skewed way, in a comic book way, of how they're different. And of course, that's not to say all women must have triple F and a 2-inch waist or something like that. And so maybe he's kind of playing off that sort of thing in order to say, here's how men and women are different. But at the same time, I think because it's a comic book world, it's super clunky. There's no real explicit nuance. And of course, he has to play by the rule of sex sells, and he has to basically pump it all full of implants and silicone and insanity in order to make it sell. And I think, and that's where the issue of women in Sin City, I think, becomes really difficult to discuss, just because it's so, it's obviously not a theological treatise or a philosophical treatise. That's the problem of narrative, is you get out what you're looking for. And I think a lot of that kind of overshadows the interesting things he might have said, and obviously the lack of like a main female character and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I was just thinking it's probably would be a good time to wrap up, because I don't know if people are going to listen too much beyond an hour, and we're closing in on that. But I was kind of I wanted to maybe return briefly to the because I think this would be a good place to close on this dichotomy of Bruce Willis as a Christ character, and then the church as a structure of authority, and how you know, I don't know that this is a point that Miller is consciously trying to make in the film, but I do think, you know, and this may become from a little bit from my own, you know, Anabaptist perspective or whatever, a little bit, but it seems to me that what you're seeing there are two different ways to attempt to live out the gospel. And there's one way, which is about hoarding power and you know, keeping the structures that you think are necessary to keep things keep the church where it needs to be and that kind of thing in place. You know, another film, The Mission, comes to mind with Jeremy Irons and Robert De Niro, where the Catholic Church refuses to intervene to protect South American tribes that are being sold into slavery by the Portuguese, because they're so worried about losing their influence after the Reformation has taken place.
Yeah.
And, you know, this idea that, well, Portuguese could always just become Protestant if we push them too hard. And, you know, so what you sort of see here is, you know, one way of attempting to live out the gospel that utterly fails to get the point.
Yeah.
And then another way, which does it just because it is modeled after Christ's willingness to suffer out of love. You know, caring even just for one person. You know, if you know that was all that sort of Hartigan needed. You know, this idea that I'm going to save this one girl's life. You know, and whereas all these other people are concerned about keeping their power or keeping these structures in place, Bruce Willis is just concerned about this vulnerable young woman, and, you know, keeping her safe and protecting her and showing love to her. So yeah, I think that maybe if there's only one thing a Christian could get out of this film, I think that would be a good place to start.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the issue kind of boils down to, and this is I mean, you could almost say, to paraphrase Bruce Willis's coming, old man dies, young girl lives, fair trade, is the idea of the righteous for the unrighteous, or the just for the unjust, or the just for the unjust for the just, even to invert it, is the idea also of the idea of the utter self-abasement that another person will go to on behalf of another. And so you could, if you wanted to draw the really explicit Christ parallel, you know, you could talk about how Hartigan is the canonic form of what it means to be truly human, and to truly live into the gospel of the self-emptying of oneself, to be abused, to have your body beaten and bruised and pierced and torn, to have your mind, to go into the darkest of places, to be utterly abandoned and forsaken, so to speak. You have, and I think that's why the story of Hardigan stands out so strongly, is that in a world of such utter darkness, and where death reigns and sin reigns and misogyny reigns and all these sorts of things have their vice grip, you have this one story of a person willing to literally empty themselves of everything in order to save and protect another person. And what is shocking about that is that it's not common in the world that Hardigan lives in. And if we look at, and frankly, nice people doing things don't make the news in our country anymore. You know what I mean? And so it's always about, oh, this person said this on Twitter, and then the world explodes, or 70 women were kidnapped in Africa, and it's a horrible thing. And it is a horrible thing. But the idea also is missed when we forget that there are people doing great things, like, I don't know, the CBE working, for example, in Africa to help educate women, and people doing all these really good things, and all this stuff kind of gets lost because we forget that there is basic decency out there. And I think what Miller and Rodriguez do masterfully with the Hardigan story is basically saying, here is someone who utterly subverts everything by taking it upon himself to be the decisive teleological act of utter impoverishment for the sake of another. And that is something that, I mean, that's what we're called to do, is to bear one another's burdens and sacrifice and love. And he does that, I think, really well. And it's why that story has always stuck with me, and why it's one of the more masterful films in terms of that respect. I mean, like I said, I think it fails on the sexual level and on these sorts of things, because it loses the forest for the trees. But on that aspect, on the aspect of suffering for the sake of another, it's the utter empowerment of what it means to sacrifice and to love and to cherish one another.
Well, and that's kind of what's fascinating, is people can always find something that they decide they don't like about religion or Christianity or the Bible or whatever, but there's something that's compelling about Christ to nearly everyone.
Well, it's funny, it's like, I don't like Cardinal Rourke. It's like, good, me neither. Let's go be like Hardigan. It's that thing where you can always point to, like, I don't know, like a Mother Teresa. It's like, I don't like the Roman Catholic Church. It's like, well, okay, that's fine. Have you actually read the New Testament? Have you read these sorts of things? Have you read Romans or something like that? And so it's
Philemon, which is one of your favorites.
It's the crown jewel of Pauline theology in my work.
Yeah. I perhaps tend to agree with you to some extent there.
I'm writing my paper this quarter on that. So.
Oh, awesome! I'd love to read it.
Yeah, so I'll send it to you.
Thank you. So if somebody hears this and goes, "This Nick guy seems really cool. He's got some pretty interesting ideas. I would like to follow up with him and read or listen to whatever else he's doing," how would they be able to do that?
Oh, well, I don't know why anyone would ever want to do that, but you can find me on Twitter. I actually need to look up my Twitter handle. I'm a horrible millennial. I don't actually know my Twitter handle. It's at Nick Quient, all one word, Quient. You can find me there. I'm usually tweeting out the podcast my wife and I do. It's called Split Frame of Reference, and we're going through women in ministry right now, but we'll be doing a lot more topics once that series is done. Next week it's on Galatians and all that fun stuff. So yeah, it's you can find me at splitframeofreference.com or on Twitter at Nick Quient.
Great. Thank you very much, Nick. I really appreciate you being willing to do this for me and with me. And it was a joy to have you on.
It was a blessing to be